U.S. federal government faces imminent shutdown, a detailed analysis. As the clock ticks down with just over 12 hours remaining to avert a U.S. federal government shutdown, the nation stands on the brink of a significant disruption that could ripple through the world's largest economy. This looming crisis, the first of its kind in 7 years, threatens to halt critical government functions, from the publication of economic data to the collection of tariff revenue. The deadlock stems from a fundamental disagreement between Democrats and Republicans over how to fund the federal government, exacerbated by a national debt that has ballooned to over $37 trillion. The consequences of a shutdown would be far-reaching, with federal workers facing furloughs and, in a new twist, the possibility of permanent layoffs as suggested by President Donald Trump. This report delves into the causes, implications, and political dynamics of the crisis, drawing on statements from key figures, including President Trump and North America business correspondent Michelle Fleury. The stakes of a government shutdown. A government shutdown occurs when Congress fails to pass, or the president refuses to sign, appropriations legislation to fund federal government operations. Without funding, non-essential government functions cease, and federal employees deemed non-essential are furloughed, temporarily laid off without pay until a resolution is reached. Essential services, such as national security and air traffic control, typically continue, but the broader impact on government operations and the economy can be profound. The last U.S. government shutdown occurred in late 2018 and extended into early 2019, lasting over 30 days and becoming one of the longest in U.S. history. That shutdown, during President Trump's first term, disrupted federal services, delayed economic data releases, and affected millions of federal workers. Now, in October 2025, the prospect of another shutdown looms large, with potentially greater consequences given the current economic and political climate. A shutdown in 2025 could disrupt critical functions, including economic data releases. The publication of key economic indicators, such as employment figures, GDP growth, and inflation rates, could be delayed, leaving businesses, investors, and policymakers without crucial data to guide decisions. Tariff revenue collection. The U.S. relies on tariffs as a significant revenue source, particularly in light of recent trade policies. A shutdown could disrupt the collection process, impacting federal budgets and trade enforcement. Federal worker furloughs. Hundreds of thousands of federal employees could be furloughed, facing financial uncertainty as they go without pay until the government reopens. Public services. Services such as national parks, passport processing, and certain regulatory functions could be suspended, inconveniencing millions of Americans. The U.S. national debt, now exceeding $37 trillion, adds urgency to the situation. With debt levels at historic highs, both parties face pressure to address fiscal responsibility while meeting their ideological priorities. The failure to reach a funding agreement reflects deeper divisions over spending priorities, tax policies, and social issues. The political divide. Why the shutdown looms. The root of the current crisis lies in the inability of Democrats and Republicans to agree on a federal funding plan. While both parties recognize the need to keep the government operational, their visions for how to allocate funds diverge sharply. The disagreement is not merely about numbers, but reflects fundamental differences in policy priorities. Republican perspective. Republicans, led by President Trump and controlling both chambers of Congress, advocate for a funding plan that aligns with their fiscal and social priorities. Key among these is a focus on reducing government spending and addressing immigration enforcement. President Trump has repeatedly emphasized border security, criticizing Democrats for what he describes as policies that prioritize undocumented immigrants over American citizens. In a statement outside the White House, Trump articulated his frustration. "Well, we may do a lot of layoffs, and that's only because of the Democrats. And as you know, they want to be able to take care of people that have come into our country illegally, and no system can handle that. And so we're totally opposed on that. But we can't take care. We just can't do it. I'd love to do everybody. I'd love to do the whole world, but our country can't handle people that come into our country illegally. And they want to give them full healthcare benefits. They want to open the wall again. Can you believe it? I can't even believe it." Trump's remarks highlight several contentious issues. Immigration policy. He accuses Democrats of advocating for open borders and providing health care benefits to undocumented immigrants, which he claims strains national resources. Social issues. Trump references debates over transgender athletes in women's sports, framing Democrats as resistant to change despite what he describes as a landslide, electoral defeat. Federal workforce. Trump's suggestion that furloughs could become permanent layoffs introduces a new dimension to the shutdown debate, raising concerns among federal employees about job security. Republicans currently hold a majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, but their Senate majority, approximately 53 seats, falls short of the 60 votes needed to overcome a filibuster and pass funding legislation without Democratic support. This dynamic places Republicans in a challenging position, as they must either compromise with Democrats or find a way to unify their party to push through a plan without bipartisan support. Democratic perspective. Democrats, on the other hand, are holding firm on their priorities, particularly the extension of healthcare-related tax credits established during the COVID-19 crisis. These credits, tied to the Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare, aim to make healthcare more accessible and affordable for millions of Americans. Democrats argue that these measures are critical to supporting vulnerable populations and maintaining public health infrastructure in the wake of the pandemic. The Democratic leadership has expressed willingness to negotiate, but insists that Republicans meet them halfway. According to Michelle Fleury, Democrats are withholding votes in the Senate, leveraging their position to push for these healthcare provisions. Fleury noted, "It comes down this time, unlike last time, to the Democrats who say they want to withhold votes at the moment because they are pushing the Republican Party to kind of meet them halfway or do some sort of deal on extending tax credits related to health care and Obamacare that was approved during the COVID crisis. So, that is the sticking point." This stance reflects a broader Democratic strategy to protect social safety nets and resist Republican efforts to scale back government programs. Democrats also argue that Republicans, emboldened by their control of the White House and Congress, are using the shutdown threat to push an aggressive agenda that includes significant cuts to federal programs and personnel. Trump's escalation, permanent layoffs as a threat. A particularly alarming development in this crisis is President Trump's suggestion that furloughed federal workers could face permanent layoffs, a departure from the temporary furloughs typically associated with government shutdowns. Traditionally, furloughed workers return to their jobs once funding is restored, often receiving back pay for the period they were out of work. However, Trump's comments introduced the possibility of reductions in force, a term used to describe permanent job cuts within the federal workforce. When asked about the number of workers who could be fired, Trump responded, "Well, we may do a lot, and that's only because of the Democrats." This statement has raised alarm among federal employees and unions, who fear that the administration may use the shutdown as an opportunity to downsize the federal workforce. Michelle Fleury addressed this concern, noting, "It'll be interesting to see whether that is just saber-rattling or whether they can do it. What is the mechanisms? Because typically with a shutdown, how it works is they don't agree on a spending plan, and there are furloughs and you come back to your job when the government reopens. And so you would have to kind of invoke another mechanism to do what they're calling kind of reductions in force." The mechanics of implementing permanent layoffs during a shutdown are unclear. Federal employment is governed by strict regulations, and significant workforce reductions typically require congressional approval or specific administrative actions. Fleury's analysis suggests that Trump's threats may be rhetorical, aimed at pressuring Democrats to concede on funding negotiations. However, the mere suggestion of permanent layoffs has heightened anxiety among federal workers, many of whom are already bracing for the financial strain of a furlough. The path to a shutdown, a diminishing window for compromise. With less than 13 hours until the deadline, the prospects for a last-minute deal appear increasingly slim. Historically, government shutdowns have often been averted at the 11th hour through compromise or temporary funding measures, known as continuing resolutions, CRs. However, the current political climate, marked by deep partisan divisions and a lack of trust between the parties, has reduced optimism for such an outcome. Michelle Fleury reported that recent conversations with sources in Washington indicate a growing likelihood of a shutdown. The odds of something being reached in the next couple of hours keep slipping. So I was hearing, oh well, there was maybe a 75% chance of a shutdown happening. Now people are raising their odds to maybe a 90% chance. This shift in sentiment reflects the entrenched positions of both parties. A recent meeting between President Trump and the four congressional leaders, likely the Speaker of the House Minority Leader, the Senate Majority Leader, and the Senate Minority Leader, yielded no breakthrough. Democrats emerged from the meeting stating that disagreements remained significant, while Vice President J.D. Vance described a shutdown as inevitable. The Senate's filibuster rule, requiring 60 votes to advance most legislation, is a critical hurdle. With Republicans holding only 53 seats, they need at least 7 Democratic votes to pass a funding bill. Democrats' refusal to provide those votes unless their healthcare demands are met has created a stalemate. Meanwhile, Republicans are under pressure from their base to resist concessions, particularly on issues like immigration and government spending. Historical context: the 2018 to 2019 shutdown. To understand the current crisis, it's useful to revisit the last major government shutdown, which occurred from December 2018 to January 2019. That shutdown, also under President Trump's administration, was triggered by a dispute over funding for a border wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. Republicans controlled the White House and both chambers of Congress, but internal divisions and Democratic opposition led to a 35-day shutdown, the longest in U.S. history. The 2018 to 2019 shutdown had significant impacts. Federal workers. Approximately 800,000 federal employees were furloughed or worked without pay, causing financial hardship for many. Economic costs. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the shutdown reduced GDP by $11 billion, with $3 billion in permanent losses due to disrupted economic activity. Public services. National parks closed, tax refunds were delayed, and federal agencies struggled to maintain operations. The current situation differs in some respects. Republicans again control the White House and Congress, but their narrower Senate majority limits their ability to act unilaterally. Additionally, the issues at stake, healthcare tax credits, immigration policy, and federal workforce reductions, are more varied and complex than the singular focus on the border wall in 2018. Economic and social implications. A government shutdown in 2025 would have immediate and long-term consequences for the U.S. economy and society. The U.S. economy, while still the world's largest, faces challenges from high debt levels, inflation concerns, and global economic uncertainty. A prolonged shutdown could exacerbate these issues by disrupting economic confidence. Delayed economic data releases could create uncertainty for businesses and investors, potentially affecting stock markets and consumer spending. Straining federal workers. Furloughs would place financial pressure on federal employees, many of whom live paycheck to paycheck. Permanent layoffs, if implemented, could have devastating effects on families and communities. Weakening government functions. The suspension of non-essential services could disrupt everything from environmental inspections to small business loans, affecting millions of Americans. Impacting global markets. As the world's largest economy, U.S. economic disruptions can have global repercussions, affecting trade, investment, and international confidence in the dollar. Socially, the shutdown could deepen public frustration with political gridlock. Trust in government institutions is already low, and a prolonged shutdown could further erode confidence in elected officials' ability to govern effectively. The role of key players. Several key figures and institutions are shaping the trajectory of this crisis. President Donald Trump. As the leader of the Republican Party and the nation, Trump's rhetoric and actions are central to the shutdown debate. His threats of permanent layoffs and focus on immigration reflect his strategy of appealing to his base while pressuring Democrats. Congressional leaders. The leaders of the House and Senate, particularly the Senate Majority Leader and Minority Leader, are critical to negotiating a resolution. Their ability to bridge the gap between party priorities will determine whether a deal can be reached. Vice President J.D. Vance. Vance's statement that a shutdown appears inevitable underscores the administration's hardline stance and may signal a willingness to let the shutdown proceed to force democratic concessions. Federal workers. As the individuals most directly affected, federal employees are anxiously awaiting clarity on their job status. Their unions and advocacy groups are likely to play a role in responding to any moves toward permanent layoffs. The public opinion could influence the outcome, as prolonged disruptions may pressure lawmakers to compromise. However, polarized views on issues like immigration and healthcare may limit the public's ability to exert unified pressure. Looking ahead, what happens next? With the deadline fast approaching, several scenarios are possible. Last-minute deal. Congress could pass a continuing resolution to temporarily fund the government, giving negotiators more time to hammer out a comprehensive agreement. This has been a common outcome in past shutdown threats. Short-term shutdown. If no deal is reached, a brief shutdown could occur, lasting days or weeks. This would disrupt services, but might pressure both sides to compromise quickly. Prolonged shutdown. A stalemate could lead to a shutdown lasting weeks or months, as seen in 2018 to 2019. This would have more severe economic and social consequences. Permanent workforce reductions. If Trump's threats materialize, the administration could pursue mechanisms to implement permanent layoffs, though this would likely face legal and political challenges. Michelle Fleury's reporting suggests that the odds of a shutdown are high, with sources in Washington estimating a 90% chance. The lack of progress in recent negotiations, combined with the parties' entrenched positions, makes a resolution before the deadline unlikely. Conclusion. The impending U.S. federal government shutdown represents a critical moment for the nation's economy, workforce, and political system. With just over 12 hours to go, the failure of Democrats and Republicans to agree on a funding plan threatens to disrupt essential services, furlough thousands of workers, and potentially lead to permanent layoffs. The disagreement, rooted in differing priorities over healthcare, immigration, and fiscal policy, reflects deeper divisions in American politics. As President Trump escalates their rhetoric and Democrats hold firm on their demands, the nation braces for the consequences of a shutdown that could have far-reaching implications. Whether a last-minute deal emerges or the government grinds to a halt, the outcome will shape the trajectory of U.S. governance and economic stability in the months ahead.